All right, let's look at another attacking game by the great Alexander Alekhine. In this game, he has black, and his opponent with the white pieces is Znosko Borovsky. And there's a few positional ideas in this game. It's one of the, let's say, more sophisticated games we've looked at so far. So white plays e4, and Alekhine plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. a6, so Roy Lopez, bishop a4, and now d6, d4. Here, Alekhine played bishop g4. This, in his notes, he points out it allows white to get an advantage with the variation d5. The knight on c6 is pinned by the bishop, so in order to avoid losing material, black's response is forced. b5, pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and now white has a very nice sort of positional move here to cement the advantage on the light squares, and that is c4. Just clamping down on the d5 square, so the d5 pawn break won't be happening anytime soon, and the pawn on a4 will be gobbled up either by the queen or possibly by the knight. Okay, but his opponent did not play this variation, and instead, after bishop g4, white played bishop takes c6 right away. After bx c6, d takes c5, d takes c5, white played queen e2, deciding to keep the queens on the board. You might be wondering, why not simply queen takes queen, and after the pin has been resolved, knight takes pawn? Well, there's a concrete reason. If queen takes d8, then rook takes d8. And now, see if you can find the problem with knight takes pawn. Well, there's checkmate on d1. The bishop and the rook coordinating to take all of the king's squares away. So instead, queen e2 is played, keeping the queens on the board. And now bishop d6. Bishop e3, both sides just developing. Knight e7, h3 attacking the bishop on g4. Bishop h5, choosing to maintain the pin here. But after knight d2 and 0-0, white decides to break the pin with pawn to g4. Bishop g6, the only square for the bishop, and now h4. An interesting sideline here that Alekhine mentions in his notes is this move knight h4, attacking the bishop on g6 with the knight. The knight on h4, however, is an undefended piece, which allows for a really nice response from black, and that is knight d5. And the idea here is, okay, if pawn takes knight, then we have queen takes knight, and if knight takes g6, black can respond with knight takes e3. And here, the knight on g6 is threatening the rook, but black's knight is threatening knight takes c2, and then knight takes rook. So this would not be to white's benefit. And if, for instance, queen takes knight, Alekhine said simply f takes g6 here would give black really nice position with this open f file to attack, and white's knight perhaps being outclassed by the bishop in some cases. Okay, but that's not what happened in the game, because instead white played h4 and now f6, giving the bishop a square to run away to. This move h4 was threatening to just simply play h5, which would trap the bishop. And so f6 gives the bishop the opportunity to retreat if need be. h5 is indeed played, and now bishop f7. And here, knight h4. White is activating the knight and looking to occupy the f5 square. This can be a very powerful outpost in e4, e5 openings. If white is able to cement a knight on this square, it can be a very powerful attacking resource and difficult for black to deal with. So here, take take a moment and, look at black's position and think, how could you activate black's pieces? What is a plan you could come up with to improve the mobilization of your forces? So the first idea that I thought of when I looked at this position was something like maybe rook b8 to put a heavy piece on the open file, or possibly queen d7 and then rook f b8 to put a heavy piece on the open file. But in both of those, the problem is black's queen is not very active. Alekhine finds, I think, a really nice positional way to solve this problem by activating the queen with queen b8. I'm not sure why that move was so hard for me to see, but it's very impressive once you see it, because now, the queen will be active on the b file and has the ability to jump into the game, pressuring not only the b2 pawn, but also, getting closer to the center. So white plays b3, choosing to defend the pawn this way. And now, queen b4, just further activation of the queen. So in two moves, Alekhine was able to centralize the queen. A much more active plan than anything I had thought of. So here, white plays f3, which it allows queen c3, which could be a little problematic. But Alekhine chooses instead to play rook d8 here. We could look at queen c3. It's an interesting move because it attacks the rook and this undefended pawn, and there's no real easy way to deal with this. For instance, if rook c1, then the queen could further infiltrate with queen b2, attacking the undefended rook and the a2 pawn. But just king f2 is probably best here for white. And if queen takes c2, now rook h c1 leaves black's queen with only one option, the b2 square. After queen b2, now knight c4 is a very strong move. And after the exchange of queens, black has an extra pawn from the pawn that was captured on c2, but these two pawns on the c file that are doubled will be difficult to defend, and I think white has adequate compensation for the pawn here, and really nice sort of queenside ideas. Okay, that's why Alekhine probably decided not to play queen c3, but instead rook fd8, bringing a heavy piece to an open file, putting a little pressure on the d2 knight maybe. King f2 is played, breaking the pin on the knight. And now bishop c5, looking to exchange off white's good bishop that had lots of scope for the bishop on d6 that was not doing very much. White plays rook hd1, and now black plays rook d6, looking to double the rooks on the d file. Knight f1 is played, rook d8, and now bishop takes c5. It wasn't forced, but I think white has a nice idea here, which is to vacate the e3 square with this exchange to allow for knight e3, when then two knights will be pointed at the f5 square. So this exchange basically will guarantee that white is able to plant a knight on f5. After queen takes c5 check, knight e3, Alekhine now finds a really nice positional idea again, that straightens out his pawns by force. See if you can spot the idea. He plays this move queen c3. It's kind of a subtle idea. Well, I guess it's not too subtle. The threat is rook d2, and of course if rook takes, then rook takes would be pinning the queen to the king, which forces white's hand. White plays rook d6, allowing black to straighten out what had been the weakness in his position, these doubled pawns. So these pawns, which had been weak, all of a sudden are a real strength, and the pawn break d5 becomes a thematic idea once again. Okay, rook d1, but Alekhine plays d5 anyway. Here, he's choosing to throw this a pawn away in exchange for the activity in the center of his pieces. White takes the pawn. Queen takes a6. And now d4 kicks the knight away from e3. White was planning on playing knight f5 anyway, though, so probably was not too surprised by this and just played knight f5. And after an exchange of knights, Alekhine is able to get the pawn back. The knight on e3 had been holding the pawn on c2, so queen takes c2 check is played. Black's position now is quite pleasant. Protected passed pawn, very active queen, the rook behind the passed pawn, and while the knight on f5 is a really powerful piece, it doesn't have a whole lot of targets at the moment. So it looks pretty, but it's not doing very much. Okay, white plays queen e2, offering an exchange of queens, and a lot of players here would probably exchange queens, thinking, okay, I have protected passed pawn, and maybe I can play something like rook a8 to try to target these queenside pawns with my bishop and rook. But Alekhine correctly decides to keep the queens on the board with queen c5. White plays queen d3, and now bishop e6 is played, looking to, well, threaten to remove this good knight. Black would be happy to exchange off this bishop for that knight. So white decides to retain the knight with knight g3, and here Alekhine plays rook a8, switching the theater of attack from the d file to the a file. Rook d2, simply defending the pawn. And here, a really nice shuffling in order to further press his spatial advantage. Take a moment and see if you can find sort of a reorganization of your forces for black. So Alekhine would like to push the c pawn forwards, which would be, you know, the next logical pawn break, but the queen is in the way. And so he plays queen b4. It's a great square for the queen. Obviously, it's eyeing up this square, but it also gets out of the way and supports the advance of the c pawn. It's also applying a little pressure to the b3 pawn, so the pawn on a2 is fixed to its defense. So the queen is really well placed on this square. Rook c2 is played, targeting the c pawn. c5 anyway. And now knight f1. The knight looking to possibly come to d2 in order to blockade on this square. Or if the d pawn were to ever move, e3 would also be a very good square for the knight. So the backwards knight move, knight f1, it has some positional logic to it. c4. Breaking open white's position. The pawn, it is a pawn sacrifice, but it's a temporary pawn sacrifice. After pawn takes, rook a3. This is an interesting moment as well here. When I was playing through the game first, I thought rook c8 would be a logical move to try to round up this pawn, but the move rook a3 is much stronger. It gains a tempo off from the queen, but it has the added idea of using the c3 square to get the pawn this way. It also, by using the c3 square, will disrupt the coordination of white's forces. So rook a3 is another positional move in this game that I really liked. Queen d2 offering an exchange of queens, and Alekhine, again, he's not ready to exchange queens just yet, and plays queen c5, temporarily blockading this pawn, holding on to the rook on a3, and continuing to put pressure here. So now king g3, white's king seeks safety behind his pawn shelter, but simply bishop takes c4, black gets the pawn back with a superior position. The pressure on a2 will be difficult to defend. This isolated pawn, if we compare this isolated pawn to black's connected pass pawn on d4 now, you can see the relative strength of this pawn, which is a real threat, only 3 squares from queening, compared to this isolated pawn on a2, which is very difficult to defend. Queen c1, putting the bishop into a pin. And here is the moment that Alekhine utilizes the c3 square with rook c3. So after an exchange of rooks, pawn takes, it looks like white might be able to get rid of this pawn with queen takes c3, but that would actually be a blunder. See if you can spot why. Well, if queen takes c3 here, then queen g1 check would be a problem. Let's say king here is simply queen takes knight. We're picking up a knight, holding on to our bishop, and it's going to be pretty easy to win from there for the world champion. So instead, white plays the move knight e3, and here loses the pawn on a2. It was an indefensible pawn in any case. But now after queen c2, bishop e6, there is a lot of it's hard to criticize white's play here. This c pawn is currently blockaded by the queen, and you don't want to use your queen to blockade unless you absolutely have to. The queen is a very tactical attacking piece, and if her only duty on the chessboard is blockading a passed pawn, then something has probably already gone wrong. And so, trying to respond to this, white plays knight d1, looking to round up the pawn on c3. However, this is a big mistake, because it allows the queen to infiltrate with queen g1 check. Better would be something like king f2, but even here, okay, white's position is pretty miserable. The knight is in a pin, and it'll be easy for black to continue improving little by little while white suffers. For instance, white could even just play something like king f7 or pawn g6 or pawn h6. The position is difficult for white. So if, back to the game. After knight d1, this check, it leaves the king with not very many options. The king runs to h4, and now a very nice idea. g5 check. Alekhine is looking to open some lines to the king and activate this bishop. And there's not very many good options here for white. They're all losing. But after the pawn captures en passant, Alekhine does not even bother capturing back, but instead plays h5. The idea is to threaten, well, one idea is to threaten checkmate on this square now. For instance, if the knight were to take the pawn, which was, something white was maybe hoping to do, then the exchanges here would lead to mate, or loss of material for white. And so after this move h5, white plays knight e3, looking to hold on to that square. It does, however, just give the knight away. And after queen takes e3, white tries for a perpetual with the queen, hoping to escape with a draw, but there's no perpetual here. Simply queen f2, and then this move sets up a mate threat that is indefensible. Check, king g7, check again, and of course white can't play queen takes bishop because it would be met with queen g3 checkmate, and after queen e8, looking for one more last ditch effort for perpetual, simply bishop f7. There are no more checks. Queen g3 mate coming next. All right, I really like this game because it featured a few sort of positional ideas, maybe a little bit more mature, sophisticated than some of the other games we've seen so far. Yeah, queen b8 was for me like a really rock star move, as was queen c3 with the idea of targeting the d2 square. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this game as much as I did.